afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Timur and I didn't even consult, and it was almost as if you were just setting up for me, so that was perfect. It's been already a full day. I don't know about the rest of you. I had a wonderful opportunity to be at St. John's Episcopal Church. Reverend Joseph Pace is here. He kindly invited me to say a few words to the congregation. I spoke, I cried, so I've gotten everything out of my system already. But I also just, I really want to thank, I look around, I see many of you who I've interacted with in churches and synagogues and other places, and just use this occasion to say once more, thank you so much, for your hospitality and kindness and love and generosity that has been so present in the interfaith community the last 10 years. And it was great to hear mention of some of my favorite people. Rich Cizik, the head of the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, is one of my favorite American, I almost said Muslim, American religious leaders. Fantastic person, and if you want to know more about the best in the evangelical community, that man is just my hero. So briefly, and after me, you have a break, 15-minute break, before we get to hear from Bruce Lawrence. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I call the ethical maturation of the Muslim American community after 9/11. And when I'm speaking about ethics, I'm not speaking about individual morality or good character, which has always been the foundation of the religious formation of Muslims wherever they are, and is universal. Be honest, fulfill your covenants, be good to neighbors, be generous to the poor, be faithful to your family. What I am interested in observing is the way in which the American Muslim community or communities, those who identify themselves as such, as religious people who come together to live their faith and fulfill their collective obligations, how they or our ethical approach to these obligations has matured over the last 10 years. And what do I mean by collective obligations? In Islamic law, there is a fundamental distinction between two types of obligations. An individual obligation, fard ayn, and a collective or community obligation of fard kifaya. So, for example, it is my individual obligation as a parent to make sure that my children are fed, have proper medical treatment, and are well educated. That's my individual obligation, and I can't just neglect that and expect someone else to do it. If I do not fulfill that obligation of care and nurturing, then I will be sinful. But I also am part of a community that collectively has an obligation to make sure that all children are fed and are cared for and are educated and are nurtured. All children. Some children are orphans. Some children have parents who can't take care of them. And yes, some children have parents who are negligent. But it is not the fault of the children that their parents are negligent. If any child in my community does not have his or her basic fundamental essential needs fulfilled, and I'm not part of working with my community in some form to ensure that that situation is alleviated, then we all bear collectively the burden of sin. All of us. It doesn't matter how good I am to my own kids, or even if I extend a hand to the neighbor kids. But if I'm not making sure that my community has some kind of mechanism to look after those needs, then I individually also bear the burden of sin. It's a very profound and awesome duty when we think of all of the people there are in our communities, and we think of the constant chain of events of people's lives and people falling in and out of need. Now, the Quran emphasizes the necessity of the Muslim community working together to do good in so many places. In Surah 3, Al-Imran, God says, "You are the best community that has been brought forth for the good of humanity. You enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and you believe in God." This is a responsibility of men and women together. The Quran in Surah 9, At-Tawbah says, The believing men and the believing women are partners with one another. They enjoin the right and forbid the wrong. They establish prayer and give charity, and they obey God and his messenger. Now, this morning, Bruce Lawrence and I were speaking about the enduring legacy of the late Fazl Rahman and his marvelous book, Major Themes of the Quran. In that book, Fazl Rahman devotes a whole chapter to man in society, where he explores the importance of collective responsibilities in the Quran. You know, I think there's 6 or maybe 7 chapters in that book. And it is such an important theme in the Quran that it takes up a significant part of the discussion of the themes of the Quran, and I think rightly so. Fazl Rahman says, for example, the Quran's goal of an ethical, egalitarian social order is announced with a severe denunciation of the economic disequilibrium and social inequalities prevalent in contemporary commercial Meccan society. I think among all of the diversity among Muslims globally, this belief that the Quran, a fundamental message of the Quran, a fundamental message of Islam, is about justice, equality, fairness. But what, as Timur suggested, what does a just social, political, and economic order look like? And who should decide what it looks like? Now, when we look at the diversity of Muslim Americans, if we just look back at the late 1960s, early 70s, for example, for those immigrants from the Middle East who came to America in that time, escaping the oppressive socialist nationalisms of their homeland, the Ba'ath Party of Iraq under Saddam Hussein, or the Ba'ath Party, Socialist Nationalist Party in Syria under Hafez al-Assad, for them, a free economy was a big part of the justice they were seeking in coming to America. And the portrait of the Prophet Muhammad and his wife Khadija as entrepreneurs, as active in the marketplace, as traders, was an especially attractive model for how they could be Muslim in a free America. And it's one of the reasons why many immigrants from the Middle East tended to favor the Republican Party, because of the economic policies oriented what they felt towards freedom in the Republican Party. That inclination, however, as we approached the 80s, started to be leveraged by some smart people in the Republican Party to also appeal to Muslim Americans and say, well, when the whole family values issue came up, they said, look, you have the same values as we do. Shouldn't we want to put in place legislation that bans all of this immoral behavior? And it was interesting to see some Muslim Americans starting to be moving in that direction. Now, on the other hand, at the same time, a large segment of the Muslim American population was African American. And for them, Islam's teachings about racial equality, with the Prophet's companion Bilal as the role model, and the Quranic teachings on taking care of the poor and needy were compelling messages. And they were very alarmed by the immigrant Muslims' orientation towards conservative politics and the Republican Party, by and large. I mean, of course, there are African American Muslims who were Republicans as well, but by and large, the vast majority then until now were oriented towards liberal or progressive politics. And what they said is, what are you talking about? Islam is about justice, and they're not speaking about justice. But we had 2 groups who were talking about things like freedom and justice, 2 groups within the Muslim community in America, and as Timur said, it was a word, it was in a way an unexamined word. And the disadvantage of the African American community is that they didn't have the technical language to speak about this issue. Their imams did not have the formal religious training, the formal training in Islamic law and ethics to be able to articulate their concerns about justice in a way that was compelling to the immigrant Muslims. And it got to the point where in the year 2000, mostly Muslim Americans from an immigrant background or first generation formed a block vote to vote for George Bush. because he promised to abolish certain restrictions that had been placed, or certain security, what was it called? Do you remember what that was called? It wasn't special registration, it was something else that was in place before 2000 that similar to the Patriot Act, allowed special surveillance and detention of people accused of security concerns. Now, George Bush didn't abolish those regulations, and after 2011, and we had President Bush developing special registration, where the male members of our community between 16 and 65 had to line up in front of immigration offices, and the sort of sweeping out of Queens of thousands and thousands of Muslim immigrants on any kind of minor violation, just cleaned out whole neighborhoods that were empty, vibrant neighborhoods, mostly Pakistani and Indian. Then the Muslim community, the Muslim immigrant community, started to look at politics, justice, what are our priorities differently. Beneath the accusation and recriminations between the two communities about not understanding politics, we had very little discussion about our priorities as a community and how do we identify the priorities. It was really this lack of a forum, or even thinking that it was in any way important to discuss priorities. Because in the end, certainly there were important concerns that were voiced in each community, but how do we prioritize them? In Islamic ethical or legal teachings, what we needed to do was examine how important priorities are, and this is one discipline within Islamic ethics, is to study priorities, to understand the difference between a three-part priority system, from the most important essentials, then needs, and then complements or ornaments or things that are good. So how do we, what is an essential? Who decides what's an essential? Maybe something that is essential in my neighborhood because it is completely missing, like a good education, a good public education is not the most important thing in your neighborhood or your life, but we're a community. So how do we discuss those things? These public goods, public interests that are known as masalih. So the tools of ethical reasoning, these terms that I'm referring to, were not widely available in the Muslim American community generally. Mostly we talked about lawful and prohibited, something allowed or not allowed. Can I eat this meat or not? Can I eat kosher meat or not? It didn't get much beyond prohibited or permitted. And so getting more deeply into evaluating priorities, needs, public interest, common interest, is something that took a far greater stage after 9/11. But it's interesting because even before 9/11, African American leaders, and especially Imam W.D. Muhammad, may God bless his soul, who was the leader of the largest African American Muslim community, identified this as important a long time ago, because Imam Muhammad and his imams, mostly inner city imams, knew a lot about justice and injustice in America, and about structural injustice, and the problems with economic disparities and opportunities in America, and lack of access to education, and how significant that is. But when they spoke about it to the immigrant community, there was a certain deafness because, as I mentioned, the language was not religiously compelling. And so Imam Muhammad began sending members of his community overseas for training in the early 90s. His early experiments were not very successful. Unfortunately, the first place he tried to send them to was Saudi Arabia, and they came back, can I say, flaming fundamentalists, and not very helpful to the community, so he realized that he shouldn't send them there. But then he started sending them to Syria, and that's really, as bad as we know the Syrian regime is, the religious education is excellent in Syria. And they've maintained excellent seminaries. And so once he started sending his students there, they started to get an excellent education. And someone like Professor Intisar Rab, she's now a professor of law at Boston University. She went to Syria to study, then she went to Qom, to Iran, to also study Shiite jurisprudence. And I think it's very significant. Intisar was a brilliant woman. She got her degree at Princeton and then Yale. And her brother is the imam in the W.D. Muhammad community in the Baltimore area, Imam Safi Rab. Intisar wrote her doctoral dissertation on the qawaid, the principles of Islamic jurisprudence that looks at things like goals and priorities and how to think systematically and ethically about complex situations. And so now we have some people like her, experts, who were able to, on behalf of that community and the American Muslim community generally, bring a more sophisticated discourse. And frankly, the immigrant Muslims needed African American Muslims after 9/11 because suddenly there was religious profiling. Well, if anyone knew something about profiling in America, it was African Americans. You know, how do you deal with profiling? What is our response? And the African American community now became the teachers of the immigrant Muslim community and also were able to teach something else. But it's not only this inner conversation that was accelerated, and it's a conversation that I think would have developed at any place, but the events of 9/11 and the reaction of the Bush administration and of many of the regulations that were put in place accelerated this conversation, made us mature more quickly. This conversation not only took place among Muslims, but also between or among Muslims and people of other faiths. Because the social justice issues we're talking about were not only of concern to us. And as I argued, even as I argued previously in an article I wrote probably in 2000 or earlier called The Axis of Good, if we are to take seriously those collective issues, if Muslim Americans are to take seriously the collective obligations that we have, our notion of who that community is that we belong to, who that community is that we need to work with to achieve the end, needs to be expanded to include the broader community of faith. I mean, no matter if every Muslim community in America set up a soup kitchen and served in it every weekend, or if every Muslim community established a free clinic, a free health clinic, and there are many, many Muslim established and run free health clinics in America, it still would not make a serious impact on the healthcare crisis or the hunger crisis in America. It's good to do, and it's important to do, but without good policy that addresses the social inequities, nothing's going to happen. We're 2%, if that, of the population. Are we serious about addressing these issues if we don't work with other people? We're not serious. We're just pretending. We're just making a show of it. And so, at the level of social justice, that was important even before 9/11, but after 9/11, the political issues, freedom, surveillance, all of these things became so much more important, and the Muslim community felt very much under siege. But we benefited from the support and assistance not only of people of other faiths, but of civil rights groups. The Quran says, "Hal jaza al-ihsan ila al-ihsan." Is the reward for kindness anything other than kindness? This notion of reciprocity, that when someone does good to you, how can you do other than good towards them, is a foundational ethical principle in all ethical systems, and it's clearly affirmed by the Quran and the prophetic teachings in many places. So let me just give you two examples of some interesting developments. Professor Ayub mentioned the importance of the common word, which is just a very important document, and the whole movement, the common word movement that followed it has had such a great impact on Christian-Muslim relations globally. And you could learn more about it by going to the website acommonword.com or org. Out of that document, we had in 2008 the first Catholic-Muslim forum in Rome. I was there. It was actually during the 2008 presidential election. And at the end of very intense 5-day discussions, presentation of papers, discussions between major Catholic theologians and thinkers from the Pontifical Institute and globally, and representative Muslim leaders from Sunni and Shiite, and a diverse approach, both more conservative and more liberal, but really representative Muslim leaders. We agreed on a document. We signed a document in the end, and you can find it on the Common Word website, in which, and I believe this is the first time, I don't know, Professor Ayub may correct me on this, but I believe it's the first time where there was this kind of Muslim leaders affirmed in a written document in such a large number support for absolute religious freedom, including the freedom to change your religion. And I believe that that came out of experiencing the kind of attacks on Islam that Muslims felt in Europe and beyond, attacks on religious freedom, and seeing the response and the defense of so many non-Muslims for the freedom of Muslims to practice and live their religion. And the jurists affirmed that there's a difference between that apostasy, the apostasy of the medieval period that was conflated with treason, political treason, is no longer relevant. That religious freedom is an absolute in the Quran and people should be free to change their religion. I think that was a really important outcome, or it's a sign of the maturity of this community. The second is quite interesting, is the example of homosexuality. One of the things that Muslim students across campuses will tell you is that very often their most quick supporters were students from the gay, lesbian alliances or organizations on campus, who also had experienced discrimination, hate speech, just general meanness against them. And what happened is that, Muslims looked at this and said, okay, what should our response be? Now, there was a Pew study that was just published, a Pew study on American Muslims. It was just published a few weeks ago. And it showed something quite interesting. The Muslim Americans were asked, and I hate these kind of questions. I feel like in a way they don't tell you almost anything. This is the question. Should homosexuality be discouraged by society? Or should it be accepted? Now, I don't know what discouraged means. I don't know what society is. This is why I'm not a social scientist, and I almost never use these things. But the same question was asked in 2007. Okay, so at least as a, if it's the same question asked 4 years earlier, then maybe it can tell me something. Well, what's interesting is that in 2007, 61% of Muslim Americans said homosexuality should be discouraged by society. 27% said it should be accepted. In 2011, only 4 years later, 45% of Muslim Americans said homosexuality should be discouraged by society, while 39% said it should be accepted. It went from 61% down to 45% of discouragement in a period of 4 years, and acceptance went up from 27% to 39%. I think that's quite remarkable. Now, I don't know what everyone meant when they answered that question, but I know from my engagement with many Muslim American student groups is certainly the change was, and we saw a number of Muslim student groups doing this, is joining anti-hate and anti-bullying campaigns. At least it meant it should not be allowed to say anything that would lead to homosexual students being bullied or hurt or targeted in any way. And so this was a minimum, I think, ethical response in saying we don't want to be bullied, we don't want to be the object of hate speech, they shouldn't as well. Now, to what extent did these respondents accept homosexuality as moral rather than immoral? It is unclear by this. But I can say that there's also a very interesting discussion in the Muslim American community saying, well, we know that there are many people who don't like, who actually don't agree with what Islam teaches on many issues, even on family law. Yet they vigorously affirm our right to practice and live according to our own, values in a place like America. Can I, as a Muslim, and I think this is where an example of how our ethical discourse is getting more sophisticated, would it be possible as a Muslim for me to maintain at least, even if I say that religiously I think any sexual intimacy outside of marriage is impermissible, including homosexual, but they should be given their civil rights and equal civil rights and legal rights of anyone else, including the right to marry. And I'm hearing those kind of conversations, which shows that, I'm not advocating for any one position or another, but what I'm saying is that this is a big change from the kind of get on board to the family values of the religious right in the 1980s, which was a kind of very superficial approach to politics and ethics and engagement. So I think that, what has happened has helped us in many ways, has pushed us to think more deeply, and we're continuing in that, process. It'll be very interesting to see if I'm still alive 10 years from now, where we are, but I think, God willing, we'll continue to make some progress. I believe that I now can announce to you that we're having a 15-minute break. It is 12 or so to 3, so if you can start gathering back here a little bit after 3, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.